Welcome to Changing Course. I'm your host, Maya Adam, and our guest today hardly needs an introduction. Melinda French Gates is known by people all over the world for her work as a philanthropist, a business leader, and a global advocate for women and girls. As co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and founder of Pivotal Ventures, Melinda has spent decades improving equity and accelerating the pace of social progress around the world. She's also the author of a must-read book called The Moment of Lift, in which she introduces readers to the stories of inspiring women that she's met all over the world. I have had the pleasure of getting to know and work with a particularly inspiring young woman who I know has been looking up to Melinda her whole life, and that's Melinda's daughter, Jen, who's currently pursuing her own career in medicine and global health research. And hopefully she'll also join us as a guest someday soon. Melinda, it's such a pleasure and an honor to welcome you today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Maya. I'm so glad we can do this.
Melinda, one of the questions I wanted to explore with you is sort of this tension that I think many women face, where we're raised to never give up, never be a quitter. And yet sometimes the right thing to do is actually to change course and to give up something so that you can move on to something better. And I'm wondering if you have any tips for our listeners on how to recognize when a course change might be necessary or the right decision or the best decision, and what are the signs that we should look for that suggest that maybe we're not in a position that's allowing us to grow?
That's such a good question. It's something I wish somebody had said to me, quite honestly, in my career, in my 20s, in my mid and early 20s. And I would say in a certain way, I only learned it myself maybe in the last 10 years. And I even had another female business leader say something to me on the phone once that really just helped me, and maybe it crystallizes for your listeners, which is, how do you feel in your career or in your job or in what you're doing? I think so often we're taught to think through a problem, think through a solution, think through, why is this not working? But when this woman said to me, she actually was calling me for a business decision she needed to make. And she wanted some advice because I knew the people that were going to be involved better than she did. And she said, I'm just as you're just, and I said, I'll give you my honest opinion of these people and my advice. But as I was talking, she said, I'm just not feeling it. I just don't feel like this would be the right thing for me to do. And it was one of the first times I'd heard a very prominent female business leader say, I'm not feeling it. And when I think about, for me, the different career changes I've made over time, and I look back, it was because I wasn't feeling a certain way in a role or in a job. And that was a sign that I needed to either change something or try to change something, maybe in my current circumstances. And if I couldn't make that change, maybe it was time for me to move on and take a different course of action for myself.
So listening to our inner voice and our gut, right?
And sometimes exactly. And sometimes that means, at least for me, but again, I know a lot of other females and males, bouncing it off of somebody else. And sometimes it's just, you need to be able to hear yourself say what you're feeling inside. And when you articulate it to someone else, and if they just hold up the mirror, you can see yourself more clearly and say, yeah, okay, that is what my inner voice is trying to say to me, that I'm kind of not listening to or letting myself articulate until I articulate it to someone else.
Oh, that's so interesting, because I think often, I don't know if this is in all fields, but certainly in academia, sometimes you're very much going it on your own, and you almost feel like expressing that to somebody would be sort of an admission of weakness or an admission that you're not fully committed. And you're saying that's a very important step, holding up that mirror and expressing the way we're feeling.
And it has to be, just as you said, with really trusted individuals who are going to literally just hold up the mirror and not have a super strong opinion one way or the other, but who you can speak your inner truth to. And I've had those people. I've been lucky enough to have those kind of people in my life, whether it was in one of my parents, particularly my dad always had my back in business, but my mom sometimes was the one I needed to sit down and hear myself talk and feel and think it through. I have that now in very good friends. And I even see my daughter, Jen, who you spoke about earlier, who's 27. She, talks to many people. You're one of them. But even sometimes when she's working through a tough decision, she and I will take a long walk. And it's really just me mirroring back to her what she's thinking or feeling, or saying, I really don't know, Jen, but maybe you should talk with this person, or maybe that person would have an idea. But so it's those trusted, close individuals, I think, that help us feel our way through decisions.
Oh, that's such good advice. I hope that our listeners will make note of that, because that's something I'm definitely going to try and put into play in my own life. And it brings me to another question. I want to segue into it because it's such a natural segue. You talk so much in your book and in your masterclass about sort of empathetic listening, and how we don't necessarily have to listen with the end goal being to give a solution, but rather sometimes just listening is such an important way of understanding an issue or how it impacts a community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think it's been the biggest surprises to me in my work. Is so often in global health, I would be out in what I call the field, say in a low income setting or middle income setting, and I'd be out with a group of men and women or a group of women, and I might be there to ask a set of questions or to try and learn something very specific. But when I just gave room and space for them to truly tell me what was on their minds, I learned so much more. And I learned often that, okay, maybe as a foundation, we or our partners were going after a certain global health issue, and maybe we had an innovative solution, but the community needed us to know that that wasn't enough. There were a whole bunch of surrounding circumstances. Or maybe they needed us to know sometimes, okay, that's somewhat important to us, but not nearly as important as I don't have access to clean water, or I don't have access to being able to get to a medical facility, or I'm in a situation where I have no power to negotiate that inside my home. And so I started to realize that having immense amount of time to just listen was just highly valuable to us as an organization, and to me in my own personal growth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's reminding me, Melinda, of a story. We were doing work in South Africa for several years with mothers. And I remember that one of the challenges was how to encourage mothers who had small babies at birth to practice skin to skin care, kangaroo mother care. And I remember thinking, what is it that I could dream up reasons why it wasn't being practiced, but only when we sat with the mothers. And some of them told us, for example, that they felt they had already failed as mothers by having a small baby, or that they had seen Hollywood films in which there were incubators in hospitals, and they felt sort of like second-class citizens being asked to do with their own bodies what they knew there was a superior, they thought, machine that was available to Western mothers. And I just remember that exactly what you're saying, thinking I could not have dreamed up what these very real barriers are.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. It's just perfect. And unless we help them overcome those barriers, just like for us, if there are things we don't do, it's often because there's a barrier in the way, right? And if we don't understand and know and learn those things, or even learn that they often have great solutions in their own communities, if given a little bit of resource to develop them further, then it's like we're kind of almost like two ships passing in the night, right? Even though we have good intentions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So empathetic listening, key. That is so important to remember.
And I think sometimes, I'll just say this, in many of the fields I've worked in over the course of my career, we've been a pretty male-dominated world for a long time. And yet I think so often some of the very best empathetic listeners are women. And we haven't really valued that as a society. But as I see more women in business, or I see more women in global health, what's happening is we are listening more, and then we're pouring that back into solutions and product development. And I think that's just a beautiful thing, right? And I think we're going to end up having solutions that'll be more lasting in communities. I certainly know men who are empathetic listeners, but I have to say I know more women who are. And so that's another reason why I like this idea of lifting up more women, so we get a little bit more balance in all of our systems. So we're actually creating products and ideas and fostering solutions that benefit everybody and benefit the whole community, not just one point of view, right? But everybody. Bring the female voice in so you have everybody's point of view.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen recently some wonderful posts by you about the importance of bringing women into politics and into leadership roles in order to make these policies and decisions more representative of all of us, of all of society. I think that's so important.
Society. And I've become very passionate about getting more women into politics and places of power, because I see the difference. When you go to Rwanda, where I'm not saying we should set a quota here in the United States, but there where a quota was set many years ago for a certain percentage of women parliamentarians, it has absolutely changed society now. It has changed young boys and young girls' views of men and women working. The head of the largest bank in Rwanda is a woman now. The laws about how you get married and the decisions you make going into the marriage about property and who gets what in case it doesn't work, it's balanced, it's gender equal. So I know that when we get more women, and I see it in states in the United States, when you get enough women into state houses, they start to create different types of laws that benefit all of society, not just one piece of society. And it's just because they have a different lens on society because of where they come from and what their expectations are, or the expectations of them.
Yeah. Well, very, very important. And speaking of future women leaders in global health and other fields, you must be very, very proud. I don't know your other two children as well, but you must be so proud of Jen and the work that she's done. She's finishing her medical degree. She completed an undergraduate degree at Stanford and a master's degree in global health at Columbia. And I know how much effort it takes to raise good human beings. I have 3 of my own that I'm trying to turn into good human beings. And in your book, I remember that you wrote about something that struck you in 2012, where you were considering whether or not to take on a more public role as an advocate for women and family planning. And I think you wrote that if you turned it down, you were concerned about the values you'd be modeling for your kids. Would you want them in the future to potentially turn down different tasks and tell you that they were following your example? And so you made a decision based on that. And I'd love to hear about your sort of that point in your career when you decided that the benefits of taking on a more visible advocacy role outweighed the risks.
Thank you for that question. I'm thinking through, how old was Jen when I was making that decision? So she's my oldest, as she said, she's 27. She was 14 and a half and going on 15 when I was making that decision. And I was out in the developing world, and I was listening and hearing from so many women. I would go out to talk with them about vaccines, childhood vaccines for their children, which they knew about, they were using, but I wanted to learn from them. But when I stayed long enough, what they wanted to talk to me about was contraceptives. And all over the world, I was hearing from women saying, "Are you kidding me? Look how many kids I have. I already have 2 or 3. I can barely feed them. It's a crisis. I can't have another. But why could I get contraceptives before and now they're not here?" And so as I listened, I realized we had stepped back as a world in global health from contraceptives for a lot of reasons, but particularly controversial reasons here in the United States. And because of that political controversy, it had come off of the global health agenda. And I really started to realize that as a foundation and as a woman, perhaps I ought to speak out about that. But it was a very uncomfortable space for me. I used contraceptives. I believed in them. I was already telling Jen that I thought she should use them when she was of the right age. But because I was Catholic, it was a very hard decision for me to make, to speak out against what my church teaching was. And so again, I went to a small group of friends. I went to my mom and my parents, and I said, this is what I'm thinking. They mirrored back for me. Then I got a couple of key individuals inside the foundation to help me think through, if we were going to take this path and if I was going to step out as a global advocate, what were the risks? Help me understand the history. What would be the role of philanthropy? So I had a little council of business advisors too. And so once I personally made the decision and I had these business advisors, I felt comfortable then speaking out on behalf of it and leading a charge to get more contraceptives in the developing world. But part of my enormous thinking in the background was, I'm telling my 3 children, Jen, who was the oldest, and even my son at that point, who was then 11 and a half, and I knew I was going to tell my youngest Phoebe, use your voice in the world. Like if you see somebody bullying somebody on the playground, stand up for them. Don't sit back. Don't be silent. And I thought, if I'm saying that to my children, but I'm seeing and hearing this because of my position, but I'm not role modeling it, then there's a dichotomy there that doesn't work. I have to walk the talk, and I needed to have the courage myself to do what I thought was right. And so it was very much with my children in mind, in addition, that I took that step. And I will tell you, it was a very uncomfortable a place for me to step into. And yet I would say by having done so, there's been enormous growth for me in terms of knowing, wow, I want to lead on a whole lot of topics now for women, whether they're popular or not, it just doesn't matter.
That's incredible. And it's also a testament to the fact that, getting out of the comfort zone sometimes is something we hesitate to do, but actually nothing grows in the comfort zone, right?
No. And Maya, I will say about you, when Jen first met you at Stanford, I remember she called me, and because again, what path you take through medicine, it looks very structured, and there are certain ways it's structured, but there are different paths through. And she was already trying to figure out what path might she take for herself through it. And she said, I've met this amazing professor mom, and she was a ballerina for so long. And then later in her life, she made this switch. And now she's gone through medical school and she's taking this academic path and she's got these 3 boys. And so you opened this window for her that, there might be other ways to do this. I may not take Maya's path, but wow, she's taken a different path. And that just completely opened Jen's mind. And she still comes back to it as she looks at which path, because there are different openings at different points, she might take.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's really, I'm actually change resistant, which is why even, creating this podcast is a learning experience for me, because I tend to wait until things are somewhat unbearable before I make a change. And as I get older, I'm trying to learn how to see those signs earlier and move, make subtle pivots at different stages that help me move in the direction I ultimately want to go. But
can we say something else about age? I'll just say this. As we get older, at least for me, I've well crossed 50 now. So I'm looking at the back half of life now, right? That's just the truth. And there's something with age where you just start to say, if not now, when?
Mm-hmm.
Why not? Why not do it now? And why not? What if I fall completely on my face? I literally thought with the whole contraceptive effort, I might fall on my face. I might be a complete failure, and I may create no change in the world. But isn't it better to try than not to try? Right? I literally used to keep a little plaque during that time because it was such a big decision for me that said, don't be afraid to fail. Be afraid not to try. And so it's okay, you're trying this podcast now, right? Isn't that fantastic? And, it may do great. You may not get as big an audience as you want. It may be a huge hit, but if not now, when? Why wait? Let's just do it.
Exactly. Somebody said to me recently, you should keep a failure resume, because if you don't have any failures to report, you're probably not trying things that are risky enough, you're probably staying too much in the safety zone. So keep track of the things you've tried that haven't worked so well because they're valuable.
Totally. And
Yeah.
it's only in that risk taking and those, as you said, that super uncomfortable growth edge. I can actually be in that edge. I'm actually frustrated with myself and I'm frustrated with the people around me. But that's actually when you know you're taking enough risk and you're growing, right? And then something new will emerge. And to me, that as you start to look back on your life, you realize those are actually the exciting pivot points. Even though you may want to sit back in the comfortable space, we're not going to grow if we sit back. We're going to grow when we lean forward like this.
How wonderful. That is my hope, especially for women and girls in our world, that they get that message loud and clear and that they do, have the courage and the fortitude to think of life in that way. And that brings me to another question for you, Melinda. You've been such a vocal advocate for gender equity, and you've talked about the link between gender equity and the health and wealth of societies. And I would love to hear a little bit more about that from you.
As we lift up women, when they become more empowered in their household, then they become more empowered in their community. And as they become more empowered in the community, they become more empowered in their country and in society. And that is how we change society. And so we know, we finally now have good research. We still have lots of research that we've just never done on women, but the research we do have, we are understanding now that when a woman gets an extra dollar in her hands, no matter where she is in the world, the way she spends it is different than the way her husband spends it. And so she will tend to spend that new or extra or marginal dollar on her family and on her children. So if you think of a low income country where it's trying to grow to middle income, having a woman have $1 in her hands every day, $2, $3, she will save it and plow it into her family, into her family's health, into what she feeds the children, into their education. When you educate that next generation, you are literally changing society. And so this is why I've become so vociferous about, wow, we need to empower women. And when women start to have, their voice, their full voice, their decision-making authority, financial resources in their hands, it just does change everything in their household, in their community, and in their country. And luckily, the economic research now that we have, presidents and prime ministers who are predominantly men still are seeing that. And guess what? They want their country to be middle income, go from low to middle income or middle income to high income, right? And they say, my gosh, we need to empower our women and get them into the workforce. And so that's a good thing we have going for us. But boy, it's going to take all of us to really empower all women around the world.
Yeah. Wow. I'm reminded again of another quote from somebody who I was working with in South Africa. She was a community health worker called Kwani Mbewu, and she worked at a maternal child health clinic in one of the townships around Cape Town. And I remember going around with her in a car when I was doing one of my medical rotations in 3rd or 4th year. And she said to me, I said, Kwani, why is it so important to support these mothers, compared to, I don't know, other target groups that you could help? And she said to me, Maya, if you lose the mother, the nation suffers. And that's aligns so closely with what you're saying, that it's the power of the mother to lift up a nation is really incredible.
It's transformative. I mean, she is the center of the family, and she usually is the one who decides who eats what in the family and in what order, and how much of our resource are we going to put towards food, or if we have our meager resources, how much can we afford to put towards the children's education, right? So exactly as that woman said, she is what holds up her family, but what holds up the nation. And that's why every maternal death is an absolute crisis. And I think the thing we're finally waking up to is in the United States, we have a horrific maternal death rate compared to other high-end countries. And that just shouldn't be. And it's particularly in the Black and Indigenous communities in the United States. And when you lose that mom, think of what it does then to the family.
Yeah. Yeah. So important. So important to remember. Melinda, I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you about another concern that we're seeing in recent years since 2020. And that's sort of the increasing number of people that are struggling with mental health issues in this post-pandemic world. And I know that there are multiple tensions feeding into that, a changing world, worries about the environment, financial worries, increasing social tensions, and all of these things play a part. But what advice do you have for young people that are just starting out in their careers and are struggling to find their balance in this very changed and quickly changing world that we're now living in?
Surround yourself with good people. Find your community in your workplace. They don't necessarily have to be in your direct team or your direct group. They might be across the company, but take time to cultivate those people and to even try and go out, every day if you can, for a walk with those people. I used to do this early in my career. I worked at Microsoft for 9 years in my very early 20s. And there were a group of us that would go out jogging every day for an hour. And gosh, my boss did not like it, and several of the other bosses of the people who did this. But guess what? It was fantastic for our mental health. It was fantastic for our physical health. And I guarantee you, we supported one another. And it's how we got through some really tough days there. And guess what? Some of those people are still some of my very best friends in the world. 2 of them stood in my wedding. And they are still the people I go to on the hardest days. And I would say I'm one of the people they come to me on some of their hardest days. So we need each other. We need safe community. Sometimes it's only 2 or 3 people. Sometimes it's maybe 5 or 6. But boy, cultivate that community and hang on to them. I've also cultivated post-work at Microsoft, a group of about 9 women that I was part of forming this group that we get together once a month. And even as we've gone through life phases, many of them have children that are a bit older than mine. But as we've managed all those life phases of, early career, kids in middle school, transition off to college, aging parents, we have each other, right? And we have each other's backs. And sometimes it's just a touchstone, that we get once a month. And sometimes we'll say to one another, okay, let's 2 of us go for a walk. But cultivating that network and keeping it and holding it tight and valuing it, wildly important to your mental health and your well-being.
How wonderful. That's something we all need to remember in these times. Melinda, I know you have a million things to do, so I just have one last question for you, and then I'm going to let you get on with your busy day. You have a new human being in your life of great significance, and she's beautiful. And I just wanted to ask you if you had a wish for her about her world that she's going to inherit from us. What do you wish her to be able to do? What do you wish for the world around her? It must be such an enormous and beautiful transition to from having your kids to having your first grandchild. I don't know if you have any thoughts to share there.
Well, yes. So Jennifer and my daughter Jennifer and her husband Niall had their first baby, Layla Grace, in mid-February. And of course, I'm not biased at all, but I think she's perfect in every way. Very healthy, luckily, and just a darling little girl who now laughs a lot. And when I think of my hopes and dreams for her, they're a lot like the hopes and dreams for my daughters, which is, and the hope for my son, which is that they can go out and be whomever they were meant to be in the world and to live out their wildest dreams and their potential. And no matter what that is or who they are inside, I hope they feel supported inside their extended family unit that includes their parents and aunts and uncles and cousins and me, hopefully as a grandmother, and the other grandparents. And I hope that she is nurtured along that path to grow into whomever she was meant to be on this earth and do whatever she was meant to do. And I look forward to seeing who she becomes over these many years ahead.
Well, what a lovely, lovely wish for her, and how lucky she is to have such a beautiful grandmother and such a loving and supportive family, and how lucky we are to have had this time with you today. I'm so grateful to you. I know this is going to really, give people some food for thought and help them to navigate their own course in the coming years.
I'm so glad we got a chance to do this, Maya. And thanks for your mentorship of Jen. And I know you're raising 3 incredible boys with your husband. So I'm just glad we got the time today.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Changing Course. I'm Maya Adam, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion with the incomparable Melinda French Gates. We'll be back in the weeks ahead with more fascinating guests as we continue to explore how inspiring people navigate change.